Hi, how are you, Miss
Fine,
Stokes?
how are you?
I'm good. I was wondering if you could share your name and a bit about yourself.
Thank you. Well, first of all, my name is Shelley
Yes, ma'am.
Denise Stokes, and I hyphenated with Hammond.
Okay.
And I am a writer and historian.
Hmm.
I also am a historic preservationist. A few years ago, I retired from Howard University Library System as a development and public affairs officer. And before that, I was one of the African Americans who had an opportunity to start working in managerial capacity for the Bell system as a result of a consent decree that was between the federal government and AT&T to compensate for decades of discrimination against minorities and women.
Okay.
So that's pretty much. And then I am one of 4 children of Congressman Louis Stokes.
Okay.
I am the oldest. I have a sister, Angela, and a brother, Chuck, and another sister, Lori.
Okay.
I'm also the mother of 3 sons, Brett,
Okay.
Eric, and Grant. Brett actually lives in this area in Summit County.
Okay.
And then, and I have 1 granddaughter who lives in Akron as well.
And how would you say those things define who you are, being the daughter of such an influential man in the area and all of the things that you've amassed in the Cleveland area?
Well, I think that our father was a very loving man
Okay.
and a very hardworking person. And we had a chance to see him as his career evolved. We had a chance to see our grandmother come home from working as a domestic.
Okay.
And when she would get off the bus and walk home to the home where we lived with her, and she was always very nicely dressed, her hair looking very nice,
Okay.
a lot of pride.
Yes, ma'am.
And then, but we also saw him working most days of the week and most hours of a day.
Right.
And, but we saw he shared a lot and involved us during that process so that we had a chance to appreciate that hard work and devotion to something you believe is important, is worthwhile.
Okay.
I think they always had a sense, because their father died when they were young,
Okay.
they knew their time here was precious and they wanted to do the best with that time.
Okay.
So I think those are some of the things that were helpful to us.
Good. Could you tell us about your decade of birth and how that shaped some of your interests?
Well, I can tell you that I was born in 1950,
Okay.
and I can remember thinking as a child how young my birth year was compared to my parents and my grandparents, and I was hopeful that maybe I would get to see the year 2000.
Okay.
So now I'm thinking, well, maybe 2050 will work out.
Right. We're looking forward to that.
Exactly, but by being born in the winter, the way the public school system worked, they had half-day kindergarten back then.
Okay.
And so I started school that January. And I started school in Cleveland at Miles Standish. And then I went on to Columbia, and then A.J. Rickoff, and then Moses Cleveland.
Okay.
And then by the time I was in the middle of 5th grade, our family moved from Shaker to the Ludlow community of
Wow.
Shaker Heights, Ohio.
Okay.
Their goal was to try to help us get, the best they could for opportunities with education.
Okay. Okay. So now, since you said you're striving to see 2050, how does just life and getting to that stage and that point in life drive you and motivate you?
Well, it's helpful to know that our father lived to be 90.
Okay.
So, and we saw him make certain choices with respect to diet and things like that in
Okay.
order to be here longer. When I look at the things they accomplished, my uncle, his brother, Carl Stokes,
Okay.
died at 68, which is the age I am now.
Wow.
So I do think about that between their 2 ages.
Right. Right.
And it's something, it is a struggle. We get presented with so many challenges in life.
I agree.
It's not easy, but there are things I'd like to believe that I'm supposed to finish. They were people of faith.
That
And
helps.
they felt they had a call to do certain things. So I'm just hoping that the things I think I'm called to do, that there will be ample time to finish them.
I like that idea. I like that idea. So you talked about you moved to a whole separate part of Cleveland. Where do you currently live? And those movements, how did they dictate that?
I currently live in Silver Spring, Maryland,
Oh, great.
which is just outside of Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Our family moved there around 1971 because our father was elected to Congress in 1968. He was sworn into Congress in January of 1969.
Okay.
It took a few years, but eventually we left the Ludlow neighborhood to all be together in Silver Spring, closer to where he was working.
Okay.
And my siblings have moved to other cities with the different career choices they made. For me, it just worked out for my choices to stay in that area.
Okay. Okay.
But we had a great experience growing up in the Ludlow community. It was the first in the nation by many reports where people came together to make integration work. And it was before certain housing laws were passed. And it was just people who decided after there was a bombing in the garage of a home in 1956,
Okay.
there was white flight, and then more African Americans were moving into this suburban community. And they had the benefit of the GI Bill,
Okay.
and so more African Americans were able to go get a college degree, and many went on to get professional degrees. So they had the economic means of moving up and acquiring some of the homes in those areas. But so many, it was the only one out of 9 districts initially where blacks were moving in. And after that bombing, there was more white flight, but some of the whites and blacks got together and they decided the whites felt they didn't want to move. They liked it there. And they met with each other in their homes, and they slowly put together a phenomenal organization. We were not aware of all of that as we were growing up. We were just having fun growing up. But looking back on it, we see the tremendous sacrifices and hard work of our parents to make that work.
So in connection with Cleveland, how, in watching the efforts of your parents, how did that aid in how you approach education living here in Cleveland?
I think that we knew our parents valued education. Our grandmother had been a sharecropper in rural Georgia, a town called Rennes, Georgia. Her father had been enslaved. Her mother was born during slavery, and we think she may have been freed. But my grandmother's parents wanted education for her and her siblings. A couple of the older girls had that opportunity, but our grandmother was the 8th out of 11.
Okay.
So by the time they got to her, it wasn't really possible.
Right.
So she would work as a sharecropper and then attend a one-room school when she could.
Right.
But she had this thirst for an education, and she wanted that for her children. And in her mind, Dad always said that was getting a high school diploma. She thought that was quite an achievement. But then they went on to do even more.
Okay. So you lived in Cleveland and you also lived in Maryland. How living in those different places has, and just being in understanding neighborhoods, what would you say are areas that they connect?
Well, I can tell you that many people who grew up in the Ludlow community, once we left that community, we realized we were in a sort of cocoon. And when we got into the real world, we found out more about how things really were with racial discrimination.
Wow.
As far as raising my own children is concerned, I I really didn't know about slavery until my second year of college.
Okay.
I didn't even know that our family had slavery in its background until then, even though newspaper headlines had said that the grandson of the great-grandson of a slave had defeated the great-grandson of a president when our uncle beat Seth Taft, who was the grandson, I think, of William Howard Taft.
Wow.
But in Maryland, they had slavery in Maryland. Ohio didn't. So Ohio definitely had issues with racial discrimination and segregation of schools and a difference in the quality of education in black and white neighborhoods. But in Maryland, they had slavery. And many of my son's teachers had never been around black people. And we were raising them the way we were raised, to do well academically. But it was hard for some of the educators to see them that way.
Right.
And they went through quite a few changes. They just didn't think they could really do the math at the Math Science Magnet, and they kept testing one son. He had to come into school early in the morning to make sure he really knew fractions. He really knew it, but he had qualified as somebody who understood algebra, you know, even before getting formally trained in algebra. They were used to that with some of the white students, but not black students. So we ended up having to, I ended up heading up an equity committee with another African-American mother. And we worked with other mothers in the PTA. And we worked to help educate the teachers so they would understand, you know, what was going on. And we also, my father actually helped me. When we met with some of the black parents, I said, Dad, some of them, he said, I know, they're ashamed. They're afraid to speak to the white teachers on behalf of their kids. He understood. And so we worked on that as well.
Wow. So backtracking a little to your college experience, and you talked about how you didn't understand those dynamics of slavery until you got to college. How did those experiences kind of bursting your bubble?
That's a really good question, because
affect things?
I had taken a lot of kids at school at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. Were talking about this phenomenal course on African American history. There were two courses, one before the Civil War and one after. And it was taught by Dr. Fletcher, who African Americans were saying, you know, this guy actually fought to get this course into the regular history curriculum. There was a Black Studies Institute at the school that many of the it was sort of an accommodation to protest. And not all of the, from what I understand, not all of the teachers had the same credentials as the professors in the regular university courses and departments. So this professor had fought to get this course, and so when I took the course, when I came home that summer, we were still living in Cleveland, in Shaker, and my grandmother fixed some lunch for me, and she said, so what are you learning in school? So I thought about it, and the most fascinating thing to me was what I was learning in that class. So I start teaching her. I'm thinking she only went up to the 6th or 8th grade. She probably knows nothing about this either. So I start from 1619, and she's patiently listening to me. And then finally I get to the period of sharecropping, and she stops me gently, and she says, I know, we called it cropping. And then I realized that the pieces I had heard at home came together. And I realized she had been a sharecropper, and that our family had roots in slavery. And so it took me a day or two, and I went back to her and I said, Grandma, how do I learn our family's history? And she said, go see Tata. Well, that was one of her siblings, the only one who never left the South.
Wow.
There were 11, 10 of them migrated north. But Tata always felt like good or bad, slavery or no slavery, these are our roots. And this is home. So she stayed there, and for that reason, I was able to go back and start getting our family history.
I think this is a fitting question. So, being able to piece those things together, what does legacy mean to you, being able to piece those things together and understand those things for your life?
Well, I guess there's a personal legacy and then a communal or group legacy, one where you identify with other African Americans, other Americans, other people in the world. Personally, it's very moving to me to know that people in our family were among those who were enslaved, and some of them actually made the trip on the Middle Passage. That's pretty emotional for me to think about at times.
Right.
And yet I also marvel at how they navigated relationships in each of the eras.
Right.
And I like that. It gives me hope, tells me to hold on during the trials we have in this era.
Right.
As far as a group perspective, now looking back upon, when I speak to classmates of mine, we never realized that all of us had slavery in our history.
Right.
All of us were part of the Great Migration.
Right.
And now we're talking about that. And
Right.
it's really nice. This weekend is my 50th high school reunion at Shaker.
Oh, wow.
And we're all talking about, well, like, where did your parents migrate from? Where did your grandparents migrate from? We didn't understand.
Right.
That's how we all ended up in the Ludlow community of Shaker Heights, or how we got to Cleveland.
So I guess it's a pretty good weekend for you.
Exactly.
Could you talk about your personal struggles with social justice and segregation in your time?
Well, I can say that in high school, something happened where, you know, we grew up not thinking so much about race, just really having relationships based on the content of character, who you had a good chemistry with. But in high school, something happened, and we sort of found ourselves, African American friends of mine and the whites, we separated. And as they talk about that book about why do all the black kids, you know, sit together in the cafeteria,
Right.
well, we did that, and it just kind of happened. And I just remember feeling the pull to go sit there, although it was never talked about. It just kind of happened.
Right.
So I would say that wasn't comfortable, but it showed how much power our history
Right.
has on us as we were entering, I guess, the age of dating and socialization of that sort.
Right. How did that play a part in your communication with your parents to kind of understand how they dealt with those things?
I don't think we really talked about it. I think our parents were so happy that they had managed to get us into an environment where we could have the benefit of this great education. And they were such wonderful role models about responsibility, ethics, hard work. They sort of felt like, you know, you've got it now, take it and run.
Right.
And there were other parents that were more involved in going to school and all of that, but I think our parents had, at least that's my perspective,
Right.
that they knew we had the opportunity, now take it and run.
Right.
And then we had them as role models.
Could you tell us the dynamics of the black community when you were coming up?
Well, we went to a black church.
Okay.
We went to St. Paul AME Zion, and that was a positive experience. We usually went there, and my father and uncle had been raised there with my grandmother. And even when but that was their home church, and so as the years went by, we went there more for Easter, Christmas, and occasionally. And then we went to other churches that were closer to where we were living. My grandmother, we lived with her on East 149th Street,
Right.
and there was a St. Peter's AME
Okay.
church. And then when we moved to the Ludlow area, there was a Mount Pleasant Methodist church that we went to, and they were all black. We were able to listen to the white stations, but we were also just understood that we wanted to hear the black stations with popular music too.
Right.
And at that time, you had Motown and all of this phenomenal popular music that our parents enjoyed as much as we did.
Mm-hmm.
So then our fathers, we knew that my father was involved with the NAACP,
Okay.
and he would take us to some of their fundraising dinners. We knew he was doing legal work on behalf of the NAACP. When our uncle and father ran, we were active in their campaigns, and so were a lot of our friends.
Mm-hmm.
We would go into the black community. We were always comfortable because we had grown up sort of like the souls of black folks
Mm-hmm.
with W.B. Du Bois. We
Right.
had grown up with both worlds.
Wow. Wow.
And then when my uncle formed the 21st District Caucus, because even as mayor of Cleveland, he was not given the respect and the authority as the top elected official
Mm-hmm.
for the city.
Hmm.
And so he had to create his own power base, and then he also had our father do the legal work for the Supreme Court case that broke up the gerrymandering that was keeping us from having a black elected official.
Wow. Okay.
So our uncle's dream had been to be in Congress, but then he liked being mayor.
Right.
And after some consultation with Kenny Clement, who had been his manager, they felt that Dad was the best person
Hmm.
to run for that seat.
Right.
So, but what I was going to say is that we had a chance to see the movements of the Ludlow Community Association, of the 21st District Caucus. Our father was the founder of the Congressional Black Caucus. We got to see how they pulled together the very first dinner, and then how they grew it into a legislative weekend.
Hmm.
And I think that we learned a lot from seeing different social groups
Mm.
and the power they can have in making a difference in people's lives.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you
for this
very
time.
much. Thank
No
you.
problem.
You had mentioned about growing up in Ludlow and interacting with your peers based on, just how you interacted. What about what do you remember about growing up in Cleveland?
What's interesting is that I just remember being happy as a kid.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, falling in love with my teachers in Cleveland and in Shaker.
Okay.
I don't remember thinking about race at all, but I do remember skin color, but it wasn't from the perspective of race, black and white. It was just looking at an outfit a person has on. It was just part of the individual. And I know my father told me that when I was in kindergarten, he saw me walking home once, and the snow was piled up high, as it used to really get in Cleveland. And he said he wanted to so badly to stop and give me a lift back home, but he said he knew he had to let me make it because of the tough world I had ahead of me. And I'm like, I wish he would have stopped and picked me up, but I guess he did the right thing, because it has proven to be a tough world. And I just remember friendships, school, enjoying school. And then when we left, though, and went into Shaker, in more recent years, when I've looked at my class photos from Cleveland, there are several people that ended up in Ludlow as well.
Okay.
So that said a lot to me
Okay.
about what was going on in the minds of other families.
So when you were in Cleveland, who was in your neighborhood? What other ethnic groups? Right before you came, we had a larger group of young people. And so they were asking, was there a Hispanic population? Was there a Middle Eastern population? Were the schools diverse? Were the neighborhoods diverse?
I remember them being pretty much all black.
Okay.
Our first house was on East 135th Street. I'm not sure what neighborhood that was. And then we moved to Garfield, 105th and Garfield,
Okay.
and then to East 149th Street in Bartlett. And they were pretty much all black neighborhoods there. I think there's maybe one white person in my class photo.
And what grade were you in when you guys
The
moved?
middle of 5th grade.
Middle 5th grade, okay. So what was your experience of Freedom Day, 1964?
Well, I just remember my father saying he was going to take us out of school because he wanted us to go to this program. He was very serious. He was always gentle and soft-spoken, but he let us know this was something he wanted to do. And afterwards, he wrote the letter to school to explain our absence. And he wanted me to read that letter. I wish I could remember what he said, or I had a copy of it, but I don't. I just remember how different it was. I don't think he was the one who ever wrote any other letter to excuse us from school.
Right.
That was the one and only time. And I do remember when Minister Bruce Clementer was killed. I remember it being on the front page of the newspapers and on television. I remember how upset my father was. And I believe he went to the memorial services.
Yep. So what grade were you in at that time?
Let's see, that was 64, and that was April. I would have been 13, so maybe 7th grade.
Okay. So do you remember, did you attend a freedom school?
I did, and I don't have a lot of memories, but the thing that is my strongest memory is enjoying the music and the songs they taught us. And I remember hearing "We Shall Overcome" for the first time and being taught the song. And then from that point forward, whenever I heard it on television, I could relate.
Right.
I do remember a minister there teaching us things, and a woman, I don't know who she was, and I remember she was passionate and serious. And I remember lots of other African American kids in there.
Okay. Do you remember where it was located?
I don't.
No.
I thought we were in a church.
We do have your diploma.
I do.
Which is really exciting.
Oh yeah, so you've seen that,
Yes.
right? Yeah. Yeah, I used to watch my father and grandmother save things in scrapbooks and photo albums. So I copied them, and so I managed to keep a few things.
Okay. In addition to the music and the introduction to, We Shall Overcome, like, what other things did you witness?
For the civil rights era?
Yeah, it was like around the Freedom Day events. And
Around the Freedom Day events. I tried to look back at what was going on, before then and right then. And that helped me a little bit. I do remember that we had a chance to meet Dr. Martin Luther King, and we went to a church. And I vaguely remember seeing him, but what I remember most is that my sister Angie said he had big hands. I don't know if she remembers that, but my father liked that. It tickled him. And let's see. I remember the lunch counter sit-ins, just seeing that on television. And our uncle was campaigning, during this period. And so, his literature, he had lots of it in his car. He would stop by our house a lot to see our grandmother and see Dad. So we were aware that he was running for state representative. We were aware when he lost, the first campaign and the decision to try again. The bombing, the March on Washington, our father took us to Washington for that. And before we got to Washington, they did some other fun things, family oriented. But when we were headed into Virginia, he said, "Now we're going to have to stop here and get some things to eat because we may not be able to eat here." And I remember saying, "Why?" He didn't really answer it. He just kind of had a little chuckle and a smile. But I guess it was about, the discrimination then. And they did not have us, we did not attend the march.
Mm-hmm.
He was concerned about our safety.
Okay.
We stayed in a hotel with our mother, Shelley Stokes, and but he was there, and he took movies with his camera, and then he gave each of us copies of that film.
Nice.
Yeah. So that would have been 63. I remember the bombing of the little girls in Birmingham, and now my best friend knew those girls. And when we encountered a lot of discrimination in Maryland, she was a math major, she'd gone to Tuskegee. She's the person I turned to keep our sons going when they encountered so much discrimination in Maryland public schools. Wow. So those are a few things I guess I could share.
So in terms of like Cleveland, being in Cleveland and with your family being so political, like what types of things were you privy to in terms of like the decisions that were being made? Like, so, you know, your dad was a public figure and he chose to keep you out, and you said your uncle was running for mayor, and, you know, this boycott is going on, you know, so like how are they able to balance like, personal beliefs, right, with the public face?
I wish I could see what my siblings think, because I'm sure they have some very good ideas and comments, and maybe we can capture some of those. But for me, I don't know, my sister Angie always talks about, they were called. Mm-hmm. And I really think that's true. They were really unique. There was just something about the way they were. They just had everything they needed to do what they did. It wasn't even, our dad would say, when he was chosen for to lead the investigations into the assassinations of Dr. King and President Kennedy, he said he knew that was God, that he was the one who was supposed to do that. So I always felt that presence. They were always down to earth and humble. A great favorite memory of mine is with them at the Evelyn Woods studio. I think it was a modeling studio or something. And there was a barbecue there. And the two of them were up high on some kind of stand. And they just sat there telling joke after joke. They had the whole audience in stitches. So it was like you were with them, just listening to a story. And that's how they were. They were just the real deal. They didn't like discrimination. They weren't afraid to stand up about it. And they felt they needed to do everything they could while they were here. But they loved us. I feel like our dad loved us, our uncle loved us, our grandmother loved us. And they loved their family. They loved all those relatives that migrated from the South, and they loved the one who stayed. Everything they did, they would send things to us, but they sent them to all those relatives too, and the whole family all over wherever they migrated to was always cheering for them or would show up at different events.
As a young person, were you able how were you able to witness like your family and the people in your community and your neighborhood, organizing and mobilizing against, social injustice, especially in education?
Well, Dad was very proud of a court case. It was considered as one of the ones that Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP, they were trying to find different cases to help change discrimination in education. And I think it was Claggett. You're familiar with it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I can't remember right now the reason why it didn't go forward, but it was significant for Cleveland, right, for desegregating schools. And for a while it was one of the cases that Thurgood Marshall and that was one of Dad's cases. Dad, even as a member of Congress, he would come back here and he would be in meetings with the Cleveland Board of Education until late in the night, early hours of the morning. Wow. That's how much it meant to him. When he retired, he could have taught law, but he ended up teaching in the School of Social Work at Case, the Mandel School. And he took it very seriously. They said he showed up for all kinds of meetings, you know, one-on-one with the students.
Another form of service.
Exactly. They really were about service. And I remember when my uncle became ill, my father told me that one of their former law partners who was struggling with MS said, "Man, can you believe it? You know, I mean, you've got cancer, I've got, you know, why us, man?" You know, and my father said, my uncle said, "Why not us, man?" They were just that real.
Wow. As a young person, like, what did you see as some of the uniting factors within the community?
Well, they loved the community. They really did. And they were not partial to anybody, but they did have a real heart, I think, for the Black community. And they were, you know, they cared. They had grown up in it, and they knew. My father used to say the people in the projects were good people, they were just poor.
Right.
He didn't like that attitude that somebody is less than
Right.
because of where they lived. I know our uncle was pretty upset when he tried to bring opportunities for the poor into the Lee Harvard area. And a lot of Black people felt like these other poor Black people were going to jeopardize their neighborhood, and that upset him a lot. So they were for environmental issues, just way ahead of their time. But as the community, you know, they loved people, and they had grown up in the community. They had the friends they had growing up were their friends all the way to the end.
Awesome. So how else were young people involved in the movement?
Well, it was fun for us and our friends to be active in their campaigns.
Yeah.
And they had, my uncle had young folks for Stokes, and we still have some of those buttons, and still have the letters, you know, thanking us for our service. There were like some gatherings where they would celebrate and they'd have the popular music on. The two of them walked the streets, I think after the Huff riots and after King died, you know, they went back to the community together. You know, my uncle was against police. He didn't want white police going in.
Oh, wow.
At one point, and he got a lot of criticism for that, but he understood.
Right.
How he was sensitive to that, and he knew he was going to take a risk politically, but he had the courage to make that decision.
In terms of preserving our stories, there's an African proverb: "Until the lions tell their tale, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." There's some urgency in our focus on Freedom Day 1964 because we aim to engage a generation that may not be present for future conversations, and many of the generations that followed aren't aware of the stories. So it's so critical to preserve these stories, but what does that look like, you know? How do we capture these stories? Like, how best do we preserve this history? What do you think?
I think you're doing the right thing by, believe it or not, asking people like me that are almost 70 years old while we're still here, and to keep doing that as much as you can. Talk to as many people as you can, and I think you're doing the right thing also by engaging. You're young, but also engaging students who are young so that they can hear this and apply it to their world and help us to do a better job as we go forward.
So along with that, like, what types of, what advice, what would you say to our future, future historians and our future leaders? I can tell you that
my father used to say to his grandchildren and to young people he'd speak to, he would say, "Do better than Louis Stokes. Be better than Louis Stokes," you know?
Wow.
And because he really believed that everybody has the power within, with faith and hard work and education, And we need everybody. One of my sons, Brett, asked my father, he said, well, Granddaddy, who was better for the civil rights movement? Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, or, and he listed all these, and he said, Brett, we needed all of them.
Right.
And so I think that's the key. We need everybody engaged, whether they're coming, their contribution is through education, art, literature, medicine, science. We need everybody.
One of the young people asked about like the white allies, what the experience, especially like the young people, like were there experiences where like a white kid was like, well, I don't care, what people are saying, I think segregation is wrong, and I'm going to talk to you anyway, and what their experience might have been? Did you witness any of that?
Did I witness it? Our parents having that experience?
No,
or?
the young people.
Oh, young people.
Like your peers, in maybe some of the places where it wasn't as integrated.
The thing
by
is,
choice,
and maybe Angie feels differently, but I think we were just growing up.
Mm-hmm.
However, we did have experiences. I can give you two. When I was maybe one of the class reps for a United Appeal program, and I had to go downtown in Cleveland, taking the Shaker Rapid Transit with a white mother, her son, and another African American student. And while we were waiting in the terminal for the our train to come, there was an old white man who hollered up from the main floor of the terminal when you look down to, and he shouted out to that mother, "Nigger lover." And I didn't really know. I mean, we hadn't grown up with all of that,
right.
Although you were hearing things on the news. You knew the word Negro at home. I knew I was one of those, but it wasn't all very clear.
Right.
I couldn't put it all together as a child. But, that was one experience. And then now, having done research about Ludlow, one of the very first president of the Ludlow Community Association was a guy named Irwin Barnett. And you see, the rapid transit was designed for white businessmen.
Right.
As a convenience. They could just have one car and they could travel from the suburban community downtown to their jobs. But most of the black professionals were still working in the black community. Our father's law office at first was still in the black community. And most of the black doctors and dentists, their offices were in the black community. Our father did eventually have a law office at Public Square as we got closer to high school. But but he was saying, Irwin Barnett was saying that as he rode home one evening, there was another fellow lawyer, he was a lawyer, and he was complaining about this and that and this and that. And then the guy, as Irwin Barnett gets up to get off on the stop for Southington or Onaway, he looks at me and says, oh, well, at least I don't live over there where all those black people are moving in. And so he said, Irwin Barnett said he found his voice. He said, well, I do, and I love it. So it's more of a parent story, than we, because I don't think we had it together at that point yet. Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned the offices in the community. Are you familiar with the building? I don't know what it's called, but 4 black doctors bought the building and started it. It's right across from where the VA is now.
Okay.
On 105.
I think I've heard about it, but I'm not sure I really know much about it.
It was a bookstore for some time. They were trying to keep it black owned.
Oh, I see.
It's a historical building.
Yeah.
But yeah. Do you remember where your dad's office was?
The one downtown. The one in the
black neighborhood.
In the black. Does 55th and Woodland sound right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you know that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. And he used to take us down there with him on Saturdays and let us play with the typewriter. And then there was a Shotter's drugstore that he would take us to get hot dogs.
Okay. My dad's family is from 40th and Central area somewhere. There's a
The Freedom Day of 1964 clearly happened in a different time. And now we still have protests that go on with, the Black Lives Matter movement, for an example. Personally, in your opinion, do you think boycotts or peaceful assembly are efficient ways to evoke change? Or do you have other suggestions on how we could mobilize to affect change in our communities?
My personal opinion, and not that I am somebody who has done anything to, only as a mother fighting for my kids, so to speak, but I think what I learned from growing up in our era is that makes a difference. I love it. That's what this nation was founded. Our nation was founded that way. And I think we should keep that alive. And I do remember once our Uncle Carl, when he was being criticized or provoked by some Black Power advocates, and he didn't have a problem with all the different forms of protest, but he felt like, work with the system. Protest, have the courage to stand up and tell the truth and do what's right. Don't be afraid to do that. But they both felt you could work with the system. That's how I think it's worth doing that, even though it's hard and sometimes you feel like you're not winning. But yeah.
I have a similar question to piggyback off of what she asked. As a mother of 3 boys, so and you had mentioned your uncle's position with police, with the white police in the community. Like, what would you recommend in terms of, advice for especially our young men interacting with police today?
It's hard. It's really hard. I don't really know what to say. I spent a lot of time in prayer.
Yeah.
And I did. And I think I will until I'm gone, even though my oldest is now 37, I have one 35, and then a 24-year-old. They've all had some unpleasant experiences. And it's frightening. It's a shame. It's real. But I can say about the social movement, you were asking me a couple of times about that. We did see, my father had, because of the 21st district, it became a powerhouse. Whereas whites had excluded them from being a power broker when my uncle was mayor, it got to the point where all white politicians and anybody running for anything sort of had to come to the 21st district caucus.
Wow.
To get the blessing if they wanted to get elected by if they wanted the black vote.
Wow.
Or the 21st district vote, which was not all black. It became, a portion of it was, I don't remember know the percentages, but I know we had more and more white in that district at a certain point. And they had a Labor Day parade every year, and politicians would get there and they would have a car and they would be waving to everybody too, and they would be on the stand.
What area is that?
The 21st District Caucus, I know it had part of Shaker at one point, but it was a cross-section of the city of Cleveland. Can you help me with that? Okay.
Down Kinsman?
Okay. I see. Okay. Okay.
Do they still have that parade?
I think they stopped it, right? After Dad died, or... I see. I see.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. But, they would bring in Jesse Jackson, and I'm pretty sure people running for president stopped by those parades. Hubert Humphrey, Walter Mondale, it was a big deal. And then they used that same technology or the same way of thinking to form the Congressional Black Caucus to also garner power and have more influence on the Hill.
So mine's is about family, and so I
Okay.
see that you have a lot of history and you talk about your family a lot. So speaking about your grandchildren, what would be things that you would like for people to talk to their elders about to prolong the legacy of what you guys have started?
I think that's great. I think that they should talk to everybody they can who's still around, because there's so much to learn about a life experience, period. And then if you can find out what it was that the Great Migration story, the jobs they got when they got here, and their experience, where did they live? The communities were changing from Italian and Polish to all black for many black people. That's interesting, even to look at the census records and see what was happening the decade before our family members arrived and how they were changing. And when you look at when they arrived, it's fascinating to see all the African Americans there, that they were coming from Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and then their jobs were porter, maid, you know, for that first couple of generations. It's fascinating to look at that. And then another thing I think that's very helpful is to go back to wherever your family came from, because what I've learned in talking to my friends that I grew up with, now that we realize we have this shared experience, is so many of us talk about that black church and the black schools, our ancestors, and they were formed right after the Civil War ended. Some of those places are still around, and it's amazing. And then the third thing would be to see if you can connect with the white descendants of the former slave owners of your family. Because that's another powerful experience. It's an opportunity for reconciliation. And it's interesting because most of ours were also people who were devout in their Christian faith, but they were slave owners. And yet, and our family was, and we still are, and they still are. And so going with each other, going together to the black church and the black cemetery and the white church, and they're still segregated, at least for our family, our roots, the white and black churches are, and they know each other. Those who stayed, wow. They really know each other and their history. Wow. But one of them gave me this gorgeous bureau that was there when our great-great-grandfather was on the plantation. And she just said, you know, this is where that should be in your family. And she said, black or white, we feel all stones are good people, and we want you to have it. Wow. So there's some interesting things that can go on that I think are part of dealing with the current situation we have in our country. It's really, yes, we have these issues, but I really believe that the hard work other people like our father and grandfather and many other, your ancestors too, because they voted for them. They could not have had those opportunities if people didn't believe in them and give them and they always knew that. They always wanted to honor that trust. So everybody can feel good about making that contribution.
My question for you is, what advice would you give to all young people about what you went through and how hate can be stopped?
How hate can be stopped. I think that I'm not as good as my sister as knowing some of the scriptures, but I believe love is the most powerful force. And I feel like that's what we saw in our family prevail, love, more than hate. And even people that hurt them, they stood up and they were not afraid to say what was wrong and tell people to their faces or put it in writing or create legislation or whatever it was, or organize a group. But love is the most powerful force. That's what I felt when they could tell those jokes with each other. They could laugh. They laughed and they loved. So I think love is the most powerful force. It's not easy to love some people and some things they do, But if that is what drives you to what you do, I think it can make a positive difference.
Great words.
I just want to say, because you've given so much of your time and we appreciate it, we have been particularly interested in the themes of freedom and community as it relates to protest and the struggle for liberation. And I just hear so much of those themes when you're talking. It's really powerful.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
Especially community, you know, the power of community, the power of family, you know, going through difficult times, you know, and maintaining that relationship and passing down your story about your grandmother and coming home and talking about and her historical memory, you know, that is just simply such a powerful story, and it's a model for us. We're just getting this started. It's a model for us to understand it's the stories that we do not know.
Yeah, they make such a difference. They fill in the gaps. They give flesh to life. Yeah.
We just want to say thank you so
Well, thank you very much.
Shelley
I hope it
Stokes.
was
We
helpful.
really
And thank you very much for helping me to do something besides have that piece of paper in my scrapbook for, oh my goodness, all these years. And it kind of makes it nice that it was that important to our dad. So thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank
very
you, Angie, for coming.